for those of you who don't know, I'm Rebekah Campbell, and I have recently written a book, which is here. It's called 138 Dates. It's my journey of looking for love in my 30s. So just a really quick overview of my background, my story, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Geoff MacDonald, who is the star of the webinar today. But for those of you who don't know me, I was 34 and I didn't date in 10 years after my first partner sadly was killed in an accident. And then I just kind of got lost, and then I got stuck. And I woke up on my 34th, it was Christmas, and I was 34 and a half, and thought, right, I've got to do something about this. Otherwise, my life is not going to go the way that I had hoped it to go. And so I set myself a New Year's resolution in 2012, where I would go on one date every week for an entire year. And I didn't know how it was going to go, or if I would even, be attractive enough to find anyone, or if there was anyone out there that, I could form a relationship with. Anyway, it took me 3 years and a massive amount of learning to both become the right person and find the right person. And I've documented it all in this book, which came out a couple of weeks ago, and we'll share a link to it in the chat. So towards the end of writing the book, I decided in the epilogue that I wrote the book kind of like a novel. So I wrote it as I experienced it, without really unpicking the lessons, hoping that the readers would be able to unpick the lessons as they went. And at the end, in the epilogue, I wanted to give a more I wanted to really try and pull out, okay, what was everything that I learned in that journey, about finding love, what to look for in a partner, what it should feel like at the beginning of a relationship. In case you don't know my story, my 138th date was I met my beautiful husband, Rod, who was doing the admin tech, and you might be able to see his photo up on the screen for this webinar. But there was a kind of massive transformation that I had right before I met Rod. But I wanted to pick apart all those lessons and work out, okay, what is it exactly that I did here? What did I learn? And I Googled dating psychology. I read a whole lot of articles online that I found from different academics on the topic of dating psychology and singlehood. And one name that kept coming up in all of these articles, well, not all of them, but the majority of them, was Professor Geoff MacDonald from the University of Toronto. And so I thought, well, this guy is obviously the world expert in this area. I wonder if I could get hold of him. So I found that he had a research lab. He had his email address on the website. I emailed him, and he very kindly allowed me to interview him. And some of his thoughts are in the back of my book, unpicking what I learned and helping me to actually turn it into something that was a bit clearer than just telling a story. When I spoke to him and I was like, this is what happened to me, and this is what I think I learned, him turning that into insights based on research was just incredible. It made everything very clear for me. And so I'm very excited to introduce him now. Geoff, you are joining us from Toronto, where it is 6 a.m. in the morning. Thank you very much for getting up so early to speak to us. Most of the people on this that are attending today are in Sydney, and are unfortunately locked down with COVID. So we will address that and what that has meant for single people. But first of all, I wanted just to say hello and thank you so much for giving up your time to speak to us today and to share your knowledge. I would love you to tell us just a little bit about your lab and your background and what it is that you study in your research.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, I mean, I'm at the University of Toronto now, but I originally, my first ever lecturer job was at the University of Queensland. So I lived in Brisbane for 4 years. I have a ton of affection for Australia. It's a beautiful place. You're so lucky to be there. And I will say for the record, I see my friend Chala in the participants list today. So hi, Chala, how are you doing? Yeah, so the lab that I've got at University of Toronto, a lot of the work that we've done has been on romantic relationships, and we've been really interested in adult attachment, which is basically like who is more versus less secure about being in relationships, romantic or otherwise. So I'm sure in the discussion today, I'll be referencing attachment a ton. But then, yeah, I mean, more recently, the lab has also started to become more interested in singlehood because people living alone, like around the world, there's more and more people living alone, living single, and there's just a lack of understanding. And I think for a long time there's even been what I would describe as like a lack of even consideration that people can be happy single. And so that's kind of what we're focused on these days, is who's happy being single and who's not, and how does that affect people's approach to being in relationships or not wanting to be in relationships.
Cool. Thank you. And maybe just because of where we are in the world today and the fact that I don't know if you're all still locked down in Toronto, but is there anything you can tell us about how COVID has impacted or might have changed how people are experiencing singledom?
Yeah, I mean, we're really lucky here in Toronto. We're doing okay with the COVID thing. So I feel bad for those of you who are locked down. We had a lot of lockdown here, but now we're like beating the crap out of the virus with vaccines in the summer. So that's going pretty well for us. I mean, to be perfectly honest, there's a little bit of debate right now as to how COVID is affecting people, because as is often the case in the academic world, the data is not consistent. I think that people feel like COVID is making people feel worse and worse and worse, but the data is actually a little bit equivocal on that. And some of it that I've seen says, well, it depends who you are. So for example, a lot of my friends who have kids will say like, oh my God, this is absolute torture. And I have a ton of sympathy for that. I don't have kids myself. I can't imagine having to keep all of that together. But in the data I've seen, it's actually people living with partners and kids who are the happiest, and it's the people who are living alone who are struggling the most in terms of COVID. So it's in that sense it's hard, right? Like I certainly think it's very possible to have a happy single life, but often that means outsourcing your social connection by like going out and doing things with people, or like going on trips and stuff like that. So I do think there's been kind of like a leg that's kicked out from single people during COVID. But having said that, and this is going to be a total theme of how I talk about things today, I mean, there's all kinds of different people with all kinds of different experiences, right? I mean, I've certainly heard stories about some people who have discovered their introversion and kind of love it and kind of dread the idea of like going back to the office and dealing with human beings again, right? So yeah, it's a little bit equivocal, but I would say that the evidence suggests that it's been tougher on people who live alone than people who live with other people.
Sure, for sure. So, I mean, our situation, we have young kids, but and that is also tough. But I do feel, I speak to my friends who were kind of in the situation I was in 10 years ago, and I wonder how I would have felt. I think part of it is like I kind of feel like it might be a blissful situation in some ways, but I also can imagine it could be quite hard. So I know there is a bunch of people joining us. I know there's over 60 people already joined now. And many of us, or many of the participants today, are single and are dating. And what I wanted to share today is when I spoke to you for the epilogue of my book, I thought, wow, I wish I'd had the opportunity to speak to you when I was dating. And I wish I could have picked your brain and taken some of your insights and help it explain and apply it to what I was doing. So we want to make this as useful as possible for anyone who is dating, so everyone can learn as much as they possibly can from today's webinar. There's a bunch of questions that I want to put to you, but also please use the Q&A. I think we have the Q&A open. Please, someone try and ask questions, and we'll try and make sure that is open so that you can ask questions. No open questions. Okay, I think you can answer. You can post questions. But I will start by asking you the question that I listed this morning. So when two people meet for a date, what is it that you think psychologically that's happening?
A lot. I mean, yeah, I mean, as I was thinking about this question, I mean, again, right, like there's no one size fits all answer to like what dating is like for people. So, I mean, I'll do my best to talk about some general trends, but the experience is going to be different for all kinds of different people. Some people, yeah, I mean, some people are going to be scared, some people are going to be excited, some people are going to be bored. I think, when I was thinking about this, I think that the biggest thing that is happening when people are going on like a first date, and especially, I mean, so many people are dating online now, right? And so you're meeting somebody who you don't really know that well. And I think that's one of the big things that people are dealing with is that, like, here's a situation where you want to understand this situation so badly. Like it's meaningful for you, it's kind of anxiety provoking, and having understanding of the situation provides you some sense of like you can predict what's going to happen and you can control what's going to happen. But I mean, some stranger walks up to you, there's only so much that you can know, right? So I think it's worth thinking about, like, what are you doing in the moment where, what are you doing to fill in the gaps because you can't actually know a lot about this person. So there's a couple of things that people are doing. One is that you're working off of scripts where, if you ask people, how does a first date go? Most people can give you kind of a layout of like, this is how it's supposed to go. So part of what you're doing is you're kind of like you're acting out a script. And I think this is what's so challenging for people is that like social norms are changing so quickly that I think we're a lot less certain of what the scripts are than they used to be. Like, I mean, there's good reason to say that, like, oh, back in the day when you would court and you wouldn't have sex before you got married, and like there was this very linear path to go from dating to marriage. It was constraining in a lot of ways, but in these initial interactions, those constraints are really useful because you have a much clearer sense of what's going on. So I think people are a little are a little disoriented these days.
Yeah.
Another thing that I'm starting to see in sorry, I want to finish this one because it's like near and dear to my heart. Is you know uh, there's this old Freudian thing of projection, right? Where like you take what you're feeling and then you project that onto the other person. You see the other person is feeling what you're feeling. And to my surprise, in the research lately, there's been a lot of evidence that people do this. And it does kind of make sense, right? Like if you go on a first date, um, again, you don't have a lot of information to work with. One of the pieces you have to work with is how you feel about the situation. And so you kind of like fill in the gaps with that. So, for example, when people are sexually attracted to somebody else, they assume the other person is sexually attracted to them. And that's just like one example of a lot of different ways. So, sometimes when you go on a first date, you can actually get a lot of information about yourself by thinking about what you think the other person is thinking. So that's just a couple of the things.
So are you saying that what you project is what you get, or what you're what you're thinking you're seeing back is what you're giving out?
What you think you're seeing back is what you're giving out. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So when you're attracted to somebody, you're more likely to think that they're attracted to you. When you think that somebody is not being nice to you, one of the predictors of that is you not being nice to them. So, yeah.
Okay. I remember when we um we spoke about what you kind of you get back what you put back. And I think you said the quote of, a lot of people come to me and they say, I've been on so many dates and all the guys out there are losers. And and you said that the one factor that's what look for the one recurring factor on all of those dates, and that's you. And you talked about your colleague. If you can tell, would you be willing to share that story that you gave me
Oh,
about your?
yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny, right? I mean, I read the epilogue. It's a big burden being the answer at the back of the book, for the record. So that's a little intense. But yeah, I mean, it's just the idea of like how hard it is to understand how much you create the social environment that you live in, right? So the story that I told that day and ended up in the epilogue is that like when I go to conferences, for example, right? Like, I think I'm a nice enough guy, but nobody thinks that I'm like over the top extroverted, because I'm not. So I tend to have these kind of like mellow conversations with people. And I've got this colleague who's just a ball of joy. And so like I've had this experience multiple times where like I'm talking to a circle of people and my friend rolls into the conversation and everybody's face lights up. They're so happy, they're so energized, they're so active. And it just struck me one day that like, to my friend, this isn't the effect that she has on the world because everyone she sees is like this. She just thinks that this is what the world is. When from my perspective, what I'm seeing is that this is the world that she creates, right? So I guess that was the point that I was trying to make is that it would be really easy to think like, oh, everyone, like nobody in the world is talkative, but there's a decent chance that part of the reason for that is that there's something that you're doing that's not drawing people out. And I think that it's important to think about what might be your contribution to those kinds of situations.
Sure. That so one thing that we've kind of polled some of people in the audience and asked what questions they wanted to ask. Please do keep your questions coming as well. I can see one is in already. Love more questions. One question which is obvious is what are the biggest mistakes that you see women making, particularly women, but could be either, as they're approaching dating?
Right. Yeah, I mean, and again, right, like this is kind of my theme is that I think that one of the things that's important to remember about attraction is that I mean, and this isn't just like grandfatherly folk wisdom. Like there's research to back this up, which is that most of it is chemistry. And by that I mean like, there is an extent to which some people are on average more attractive than other people, but when you break it down statistically, most of what makes somebody attractive is the unique match with one particular person, right? So, I kind of say that as a caveat because, there's not one right way to date, right? Like the right way to date is to find the person who you match with well. So, to the extent that that's true, I would say that one principle that comes out of that is and it's hard. It's hard on first dates, especially like first dates that are, like matchmaker dates or online dates or something like that, where you don't know the person. But honestly, I think that the best strategy is to be authentic. And then you'll find out sooner rather than later whether you and that other person are an actual match. I mean, one of the hard things about being that is, I mean, nobody likes being rejected. Nobody likes being turned down. And if you're authentic and you're turned down, that hurts even more. And so I think people try to like circumvent that pain in the short term by like, trying to put on their smiliest persona. But it'll just take you longer at that point to figure out whether that person's the right fit for you. And I would say with women in particular, and especially I'm going to say like women who show up to an event like this, right? Because I definitely recommend that people look into attachment theory. I know that we're pitching 138 dates, and based on the epilogue, it's a fantastic book. But there's a book about attachment by Amir Levine that people might be interested in looking into. There's one type of insecurity in relationships that's called anxious attachment, and women tend to be higher in anxious attachment than men. And anxious attachment is basically people who they tend to feel more negative emotion just generally in life, and they tend to look to other people to make them feel better. And so these are the kinds of people like you would describe as like the needy type in a relationship, or who get like overly dependent on relationships, who like really really want to be in a relationship, but at the same time they're kind of scared to approach one because they don't feel good about themselves, and so they're worried that they're going to get rejected. And so there's this big tension and emotional reaction to dating because you really really want it and you're really really scared of it at the same time. And again, like on average women are higher in this than men. And also, in my experience, the people who take a real interest in like, am I doing the right thing when I'm dating? It's the people who have these kinds of intense feelings about it, right?
And
And
so how do you get over that? What do you do about that? If you think
um
anything, I might be like that. I definitely was like that. What do
yeah.
you do?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think one is, I mean, first of all, pay attention to it. And so like you'll end up doing things like you'll be the person who goes to speed dating and tries really hard or like thinks about it for a week ahead of time or something like that. I mean, in terms of actually doing, I think it's a long-term solution, right? Like it's gonna be really hard to recognize at first, because the kinds of people who are prone to that kind of behavior, also tend to experience a lot of shame, for example, right? And so like having this tendency doesn't make you a bad person, but the kind of person who has this tendency will be like, oh, that's going to ruin my life because I'm like that, right? And so part of it is just kind of like calmly accepting, this is just a thing that people do. I do it. It's getting in my way. And then, and now I'm going to engage in my favorite hobby, which is telling people to go to therapy. This is the kind of stuff where, like, if you put some long, slow work into it, and basically the trick, from what I can tell, is learning to sit with negative emotion. That, like, at the heart of this kind of pattern is a sense that, like, I get upset a lot and I can't deal with that myself.
Yeah.
This is why I need a relationship, right? And so that the more that you get better at dealing with the negative emotion yourself, you get to pick partners not because you need them like you need a life raft. You get to kind of be calm about it and be like, well, I can pick people on other characteristics other than just like, this is going to make me feel some relief in the short term. So it's a long, slow investment.
I mean, definitely. I think in my story, I started out caring so much. I mean, my first date in 10 years, like I was prepared for kind of 2 weeks for this date. And then like gradually as I went through the journey, by the end, by 138, I mean, I did go through something kind of quite transformational before I met Rod, but I also was at a point when I was just like, I just had no expectations whatsoever. It was just like, I've done 137 dates now. This is my 138th date. I'm not even really trying anymore. And then the right person comes along, and then it's just a very natural conversation.
And sorry, Rebekah, I mean, just one thing I'd like to add to that too, because I think your story there is important in a number of ways. And one in particular is like, we as psychologists, we tend to think about things in terms of like personality traits and stuff like that. But, I will say this kind of anxious response, I mean, sometimes that's the healthy response to a real situation. Like when you haven't been on a date in 10 years, there is going to be a lot of uncertainty, and so
Yeah.
that's going to bring people's anxiety levels up. So, I think that's the other thing is like, getting to know yourself really well, and also recognizing when sometimes the big emotional reaction is actually a very appropriate reaction to the situation.
And I'm just going to ask you one thing, just briefly, because we are starting to get a bunch of questions coming through. We talked about chemistry. You mentioned chemistry before, and you talked about how often, particularly women, confuse
Mm.
what is it supposed to feel like at the beginning of a relationship. This was my question, and how unreliability can be confused as chemistry.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, all the time, women have met someone and then they're just like, oh, I'm not sure, he's really nice, but I just don't feel it. Can you
Uh-huh.
explain?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. But I mean, the principle behind like chemistry and passion in the early stages of relationships, the thinking is that the reason why it's so easy to feel that level of passion in the early stages of relationships is because of the uncertainty, right? That there's something about like, I want this person to like me. I don't know if they do. Oh, I got a little crumb that they do like me. Oh my God, that feels so good, right? And like at the neurochemical level, like it releases dopamine
Yeah.
that you get when you do like a line of cocaine, basically, right? So it's literally this like addictive kind of rush that you get in response to that kind of uncertainty. And that's just in the early stages of relationships, that's just natural, because when you go on that date with someone for the first time, you really don't know if you like that person, right? But I mean, one of the things that I think that the research shows, that like if you really want like the long-term committed relationship, if you want to go the like 50 years with one person, having someone who's really conscientious, someone who's really reliable, and who doesn't pull a lot of surprises on you is probably going to be a healthy trait to have for that long-term relationship. The problem is, of course, that like goes in a little bit the opposite direction of what produces passion. Like uncertainty and novelty is what produces passion, right? So that's the thing, is that like if you're dating someone who like they ghost for a couple of days and then they come back and then they like they're running this kind of like hot and cold behavior, right? It can be addictive, because you're getting these rushes. There's uncertainty, and oh, now they want me, and there's uncertainty, and now they want me, right? So that I think is arguably one way where, like, if that kind of intense chemistry is lasting, past like the 6-month kind of stage. Now, for some people, they're just like that, right? Like some people are very, for example, creative people who themselves are able to inject a lot of healthy novelty into relationships. I wouldn't want to say that every time that happens that that's a bad thing, but sometimes what that goes along with is you're kind of being strung along,
So at the beginning of my journey, I made a list of what I was looking for in a partner, and it was smart, tall, and fun, which I kind of debunked all of those things throughout the journey as being, tall obviously was completely superficial, and I got very upset when someone I dated told me that they only dated blondes, and then I thought, hang on, me only dating a certain height is really exactly the same thing, and then also I learned that, of course, nice and caring is the most important trait to look for. But when I interviewed you, you said that you'd spent a lot of time researching the personality traits of people who have successful long-term relationships. Can you tell us, just briefly, a little about that research and what you found in terms of what should we be looking for?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I will, I'm such an academic. I need like 8 minutes of caveat before I answer any question. Right. But like, I mean, partly it depends what you're looking for. Right. Like if you're just looking for like a short-term sexual fling, for example, then yeah, go nuts with the superficial things, like whatever pushes your buttons. And there's nothing wrong with that. Right. But in my field, we spend a lot of time thinking about if you do want that long-term committed relationship, right? Like what are the traits that go along with being good at long-term committed relationships? And I would say that there's probably three main ones that would be useful for most people. One of them, like I said, is conscientiousness. And I think that's not on the top of a lot of people's lists. It's not the sexiest trait in the world, but a healthy relationship is something where you can trust the person to deliver, and conscientious people are good at that. Like conscientious people, once they get a goal in mind, are really good at executing that goal. And so once they've just committed to a relationship with you, they're just going to be good at life. They're going to be good at doing the things, like conscientious people are less likely to cheat. They're less likely to flirt with other people because their goal is to stay in the relationship, and they recognize that's going to take them in a different direction, right? Another one is what we call neuroticism, which is basically like, how much do you chronically feel negative emotion? That and again, this is something that lots of people struggle with. It's kind of normal to be somebody who wrestles with a lot of negative emotion. One of the reasons that's important to get under control is kind of like I was talking about with anxiously attached people. People who have a lot of negative emotion like that, they tend to be more sensitive to rejection. You kind of be able to need to take a punch in a relationship. Like not everything's going to go perfectly. If you're better at sort of like not taking things personally, not withdrawing emotionally every time there's a problem, then you're going to have a better chance of making it in the long term. So people who are not so negative. I mean, I will say back in my online dating days, like I'm not much into the idea of red flags, but I did have one red flag, which was if in your dating profile, you are talking about the things that you hate, I'm like, I think that you're high in negative emotion. We haven't even met each other yet, and you're talking about what you hate. I don't want to see what happens when we actually meet in person, right? So those kinds of negative emotion words, I think, might actually be cues to higher levels of negative affect. Yeah. And then the last one I'll talk about is agreeableness, which is conscientiousness, neuroticism, and agreeableness. Just a nice person,
Yeah.
It's again, like same thing, like you're going to need to have a lot of give and take in a long-term relationship. And agreeable people, they're willing to give. And I think that's really important. So yeah, I mean, I think that those are three traits that the research would suggest would be useful to look for.
Yeah, and I think also to look at yourself and as well. I think early in the relationship, realizing I had to give more than I probably would have thought, and also my partner did as well, and it worked. But we were super committed that it was going to work. So because we're both conscientious people, I guess. So just a question's come in from Kirsten. She just asked, going back to attachment theory, is there a difference in middle-aged demographic between parents and non-parents in terms of attachment and emotional availability? Does that mean people who have become parents and people who are not parents in terms of attachment and emotional availability? Is there anything you know about in this space?
I don't. It's funny because I'm getting really, really, probably not coincidentally, as I get older, I'm getting more interested in the aging literature.
Mhm.
But I've looked at that more in terms of singlehood and happiness with singlehood than about attachment per se. I will say that, like, having kids is a real challenge for a relationship. It increases the demands on people. It increases, I mean, the lack of sleep just in and of itself is kind of an issue that's going to put people on edge a little bit. And so I think in that sense, there's just something structural in being a parent where when you have to give to more people, like love isn't a zero sum game, but like time is a zero sum game, right? And so it just stresses your availability, not just emotionally, but just practically at that point. So lots of relationships, when kids come along, there's a dip in people's satisfaction. I think that what goes up is people's sense of meaning, right? That I think that, like, as the day-to-day struggles kick in, there's also this like sense of like, oh, well, we're working together on this really important team project.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would, I haven't seen it in terms of attachment data, but I would, I know for sure that there's like less satisfaction, more conflict when kids come along. It kind of gets more challenging that way. I will say this is an attachment, but general personality. I mean, the good news is that generally speaking, as people get older, their personality traits all go up in the healthy direction. So as people get older, they get less neurotic, they get more agreeable, they get more conscientious. So I mean, this is what I tell my 20-year-olds in my undergrad class, is that like, if you want to be a better person, just live long enough. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the good news, is all of this stuff in general goes in the right direction as you get older.
Okay, great. Yes, I certainly feel happier as I've gotten older. Now have more experience, used to take everything personally, now realize that it's not all about me, it's often the other person that's got issues. So I think, and there's one question from Stephanie that I might have a crack at answering first, which is how do you build resilience in dating so you can better deal with rejection and don't become disillusioned? So I mean, I did 130. I might just have a quick crack at answering that, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure.
So
Yeah, of course.
I obviously did 138 dates, so it became quite resilient. I think, like, initially, so if you don't know me, I've built businesses, like large kind of startup businesses, and I am just a pathologically optimistic person. And so I always believed that when I start a business, I always believe it's going to work out, even though it's really, really hard. And often things fail, but you've got to believe that it's going to work eventually. And I took that same mindset into dating. And so I think having that kind of underlying optimism, underlying belief that he was out there, I was going to find him, he was just waiting for me, and it was going to be brilliant at the end, that kind of got me through. And then something early on that happened, I went on a great date with this guy who was a lawyer, who was very attractive. And then we kissed, and I was like, and then he said, I'll call you tomorrow. And he never called me again. And it was my third date. I think I was really upset. I spent 3 days staring at my phone, started sending texts and all the things you're not supposed to do. And I went to see my therapist, and she gave me some great advice, which was that he's just not buying what you're selling. And she just said, think of yourself as a product, and that you need to find the right buyer for your product. And imagine that someone is out there and they're looking for exactly you. And he just wasn't looking for you. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with the product. It's just that he's not buying what you're selling. And so that made me kind of disconnect myself from kind of like, feeling that I was being rejected, as opposed to like, I just wasn't the right fit for him. There's nothing wrong with me. And that really did help. And then it was just practice more. The more rejection I got, the less it seemed to hurt. And then when you meet the right one at the end, you totally know. So then that was kind of the resilient story, I guess. Geoff, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that came to mind for me in terms of like, well, there's two things. The first thing that came to mind is having what I would call a diversified life portfolio. So, if your idea is the only thing that's going to make me happy in this life is a romantic relationship, then it it's going to make the ups and downs really intense, because when it goes well, your life is saved, and when it doesn't go well, your life is ruined. And so, this is why, investing part of yourself into your job or your career, investing part of yourself into your family, investing part of yourself into a hobby, for example, like the more things that you have going on in your life, none of them, like will never be the case that all of them are going well. But on the day that you get rejected on the date, maybe you've also got that like painting that you're working on that you're really happy about, right? So you can kind of like bounce around to the things that are going well,
Yeah.
by not like overly investing yourself in the one thing. And I guess the other thing, and this is going to be, the existential philosophy part of today's lecture, but you say disillusioned like it's a bad thing. And sometimes what some people call being disillusioned is making peace with the reality of your situation, right? So like we've got this one study that we're writing up in my lab right now, where what we found is that as people get older, the more that if you're single and you're holding on to a desire for a romantic partner as you get older, that's associated with your life satisfaction going down and down, because there's less people in the dating pool as you get older. It's kind of like a less realistic project. It's definitely doable. Like, I'm not trying to say that it's not doable, but there's something freeing in being the kind of person who's like, I'm going to be okay if this doesn't work out, And so, sometimes being disillusioned isn't the worst thing, right? Like sometimes that's another way to put that is, I'm being realistic about my situation, and here's my idea for how I can be happy even if this doesn't work out. And that way, if it doesn't work out, it's not life or death at that point. So yeah, I don't know. That's not going to work for everybody, I don't think. But maybe just entertaining. Maybe I don't need this. Maybe there's other ways for me to be happy. What are those? Without necessarily saying like that means that I shouldn't date, but just yeah, like I say, diversifying your portfolio is probably not the worst idea.
So I know that you do a lot of research as well as in dating, but also in just relationships in general. And one thing I really want to learn more about is how relationships form. So when two people meet, whether it's a friendship or a relationship, how do you go from, nice conversation to like a deeper connection where
Mhm.
you want to be there for each other? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we think about it in my field is that it's all about the building of trust. And so, the way that that process works, like it's kind of funny, right? Like when you have a conversation with somebody, on the surface, like let's say like you sit down next to somebody on a plane, for example. I remember planes from long ago. So you sit down next to somebody on a plane. On the surface, it just seems like you're doing chit chat, right? But from a researcher's perspective, from a relationship researcher's perspective, in part what you're doing is you're figuring out how much can I trust this person. So what you do is you disclose a little bit about yourself, like, oh, I'm a professor, for example, right? And then you watch what they do. Do they make fun of that? Do they disclose what they are? Do they ask you questions about it? And basically what you're testing is, how responsive is this person to me? Are they willing to be vulnerable in return for me being vulnerable? Are they curious about me? And that's what those conversations are. Like, they're not just kind of like, people call that superficial conversation, but it's really not, right? Like, it's people testing the waters. And then, for the relationships that end up being really deep, is you just keep following that path where you disclose more and you see, oh, the other person disclosed more. And you kind of go back and forth in this dance of trust. It's really well exemplified. There was like a New York Times piece a number of years ago called "To Fall in Love with Anyone, Do This." And it was completely based on this research. You might have heard of this, where it's like the writer of the piece goes to a bar with her friend, and they've got this list of 36 questions that Art Aaron had come up with. And
Yeah.
basically the questions are designed to go like deeper and deeper in terms of intimacy. It starts with things like, what job do you have? And we use this in my lab on a semi-regular basis. Like, it goes as far as like, tell me something that you've never told anyone before, right? And what you're doing at that point is you're fast forwarding the process that happens normally slowly over time of the dance of trust. And once you figure out that you can trust people on the small stuff, you're ready to move to the next step and trust people on the bigger stuff, right? And that just goes in this like usually slow linear kind of pattern.
Yeah. That's really interesting. When I think about my first date, Rod, we got quite deep pretty early in the conversation. We were probably only half an hour in, and we were talking about our relationships with our families and
Mm-mm.
a teacher, and I asked him what makes a great teacher. But what do you think is good in terms of a date? What makes a good? What kind of questions could you be asking, or what do you think makes a? Do you have any ideas for first dates?
Yeah, I mean,
Superficial conversation.
yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, I've got a friend slash colleague, Guy Itchikoff, who does research on listening, and so there's some I don't really know them because this isn't entirely my research area, but like there's some very simple principles about how to listen to people well, right?
Yeah.
And I think largely. And this is really me doing more of like a layperson's perspective, but I think what makes a good what makes a good listener um, is exploring the world from that other person's point of view, trying to understand how it is that they see the world in a non-judgmental kind of way, right? So, I think it's about asking questions that convey to people, I'm interested in how you see things, and when you tell me, I'm not going to judge you. And I think that that opens up a lot of space for really interesting conversation that makes people feel safe being vulnerable. And then that's when you go, move past the superficial part. Because again, right, like it's all about this dance of vulnerability. And it's kind of your job to signal to other people that this is a safe place to be vulnerable. And once you do that, things can get really interesting.
Yeah, interesting. One thing we spoke about, which I wrote in the epilogue and then got edited out, is that early in the early in the book, my therapist told me to ask about the guy's relationship with his mother, and that this
Mm,
relationship with your opposite gender parent is a good indicator for how their relationship is going to go with you. But you said that there has been some new longitudinal research which kind of debunks that theory. So tell us, like, will women look for the relationship they had with their dad, and should you be concerned or want to know about the relationship that the guy has with their mother?
um, yeah, I mean, yes and no. So, the research on attachment theory had traditionally come from this very like psychodynamic Freudian kind of perspective that was like your relationship with your mother, your relationship with your father, like caused you to be the way that you are now. And that's the kind of stuff that in the literature, like it turns out that, how your mom or your dad treated you is far from the only thing that affects how you are as an adult. And in fact, I'm starting to think that um because well, anyways, that's a nerdy point that I don't need to go into, but anyways, nevertheless, right, like I don't think that the evidence is super strong. There's a little bit of an effect for how your parents treated you, but there's a bunch of other stuff going on. Having said that, I do think that that's a useful question to ask, not necessarily because what you're getting at then is the real heart of where that person's issues or lack of issues come from, but because getting people to talk about an emotional issue is a good opportunity to see how they manage dealing with emotional stuff, right? And so there's actually an entire line of attachment theory research where rather than asking people these self-report questions, like put on a questionnaire 1 to 7 how you feel about this, they do a whole interview, and basically what they interview you about is like, what is your relationship with your parents like? And the kind of stuff that they look for is, well, when people are talking about the stuff that when people talk about difficulties that they had with their parents, do they get really emotional and worked up about it, which suggests that they have emotion stuff that they haven't processed and dealt with yet, which isn't the best. Or another thing is that they kind of try to pretend that nothing bad ever happened, right? So if they're like, yeah, my dad was never home, but it was fine, it didn't bother me, that's when the interviewer's like, I don't believe you, right? And kind of the healthier way to talk, the healthy sign of people dealing well with their negative emotion is people telling stories along the lines of like, yeah, I mean, dad was never home because he worked so much, it was really hard, that really hurt, but now that I'm older, I see the pressures that he was under and I understand where he was coming from. It definitely hurt me, but I understand it now, right? Where like people like acknowledge the negative emotion but have made sense of it in a way that it doesn't make them feel like bad about themselves anymore, and it doesn't serve as like a disconnection between themselves and their father anymore, right? So I think it's a useful question, just maybe not for the reasons that your therapist thinks it is.
Okay, thank you. Um, So the topic of sex and dating. So I'm not sure how much research you've done into this, but I know, which I've written in my book, it's kind of embarrassing now to talk about it, but it's all in here, was, I obviously was single for 10 years and then started dating someone. And I thought, well, how long are you supposed to wait? And so I Googled it and I read like a awful forum on Reddit. It was like 6 weeks, 6 weeks is all anybody will wait. And so I kind of rushed into it and made an awful, humiliating message and never heard from the person again. Then obviously kind of worked it out, but what is it on the process, on the journey of becoming vulnerable and building trust? How should you deal with sex with a new partner? And in a way that's like not weird, because you have the trust there already. Like what have you learned about this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I have to say too, I mean, I admire your willingness to put yourself out there like that. That's I this is a big deal authoring a book like that. So I hope that's you're feeling okay about that, because
I felt like there must be other women out there that have gone through this. I couldn't find anyone who'd written about it. And so I was like, if there's anyone like this and has these fears and makes these stupid mistakes, then I want to put it out there so that I can avoid someone and going through this. Anyway, please tell us, what do you know?
We thank you for your service. Yeah, I mean, sexuality is kind of like a little bit of the work that I do, but like not a ton of it. But I don't know. I mean, my philosophy about the whole thing is that I think that sometimes, people start to think of sex as this completely otherworldly thing, right? That like it's this domain that's separate from everything else that people do. And my sense in looking at the literature is that like the people who like having sex together, it's not just they like having sex together, they like doing lots of things together. They like to go bowling together or sailing together or whatever, right? Like they're kind of just people who have learned to be open and communicate. I mean, granted, I mean, it is a different domain in terms of like, you can't help what you're attracted to, right? And so you definitely need to factor that in. You kind of need to be honest with yourself about like, what do I like and what do I don't like? What are my needs? That kind of thing, right? So I mean, to an extent, I guess my philosophy is that it's like it's an outgrowth of all of the other stuff that you're doing as you get to know somebody in a relationship. And that lots of first things that you do in a relationship of any kind have that combination of like excitement and awkwardness, right? And I think that the transition into a sexual relationship is exactly like that. I think that one of the traps that people can fall into here is that in my former grad student Jess Maxwell, who's actually at University of Auckland now, and so she's amazing and she's loving her life in New Zealand. She's done work on what she calls growth and destiny beliefs in sexuality, and destiny beliefs are basically the idea that it's supposed to work right away, which actually does happen for some people. The trick when you've got destiny beliefs about sex like that is that when a problem comes along, like somebody's going through a period of low sexual desire, the sexual destiny belief type people are like, oh, that means that we're not supposed to be together. Right. Whereas there's another belief that she talks about, sexual growth beliefs, which is about, treating sex like anything else. You get out of it what you put into it, right? And that when there's difficulties, you need to put work into it in order to like communicate and figure out what to do. And that those kinds of beliefs tend to be associated with, a more sustainable sexual relationship, right? So I think part of it is just being okay with the fact that it might not work right away, that things might be awkward, and that you need to make some investments in it. I guess the other thing that comes to mind is that there's a lot of work by my colleagues here in Toronto, Amy Muse and Emily Impet, and they focus on what they call sexual communal strength, and that's basically a fancy way of saying that the people who have the best sex lives are the people who enjoy being giving sexually. So that's something else to think about, right? Is kind of like going into the sexual part of the relationship and not just thinking about like what's the personal gratification that I'm going to get out of this, but also kind of being focused on being a giving sexual partner. That those kinds of people, they tend to have more desire, they tend to have more satisfying sex lives, and they tend to deal with sexual difficulties better. Now, mind you, the one thing that I always ask Amy and Emily is like, how do you become more sexually communally motivated? And I've never gotten a good answer out of them. So I don't know how to improve that, but at least I know what the goal is.
Probably just deciding to be more giving. I think giving is something that is like it's a decision, really, right? It's not really something that kind of like you manifest through any other way other than deciding that I'm going to be a more giving person.
I mean, I guess the thing I think you're absolutely right. And I think that like for example, the attachment type that we haven't been talking about today is what's called avoidant attachment. And this is something, especially for the people on this, chat who are interested in dating men on average tend to be higher in attachment avoidance. And these are the people who are like, they're like emotionally distant, like they are not so sure if they want to be in relationships, that kind of thing, right? They're the people I think who have the most work to do in terms of that giving mindset. And one of the things I talk about with the avoidant people is those are people who they don't always pay attention to the fact that it feels good to be good to other people. And so I think that would be something else, is like just paying attention to the pleasure that comes from being kind to other people or being giving to other people. Because some people miss those signals, because that, recognizing that it feels good to be good to other people, that can be scary for some people, because that's going to make you want to get close, and not everyone feels comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I had another question, but now I forgot. Sorry, no, I remember my question now. So if you do date someone and you think this guy has a attachment avoidance issue, potentially, the distance, or what should you do? Is it worth trying to persist? And if so, like, yeah, is this someone you should avoid? Yes.
I think it's, this is a little bit, in terms of the research, I think this is a little bit up for debate at the moment. I mean, part of it, again, right? Like there is no like should or shouldn't, so it's kind of like up to each individual to decide, what do I not want in a relationship. It's gonna be tricky with the avoidant people, because I do think that like the more anxious people, if you say like, oh, if you go to therapy, your relationships will go better, it's relatively easy to motivate the anxious people because they want their relationships to go well so badly, they'll do that, right? Whereas if you tell an avoidant person, if you go to therapy, your relationships will go better, is kind of like telling people like, I don't know, like if you go to therapy, you'll be better at eating your vegetables. Like if you're not that motivated to eat vegetables in the first place, you're not going to be motivated to go to therapy. Having said that, there is a little bit of initial work right now, and I think we need to see in the long term how well this holds up. But it does kind of suggest that with avoidance, one like this is when I talk to my students about this, I refer to avoidance as they're the cats of the relationship world, where like you need to be patient with them. Like with cats, you need to let them come to you, but when they do come to you, you kind of need to be like as consistent and warm as you possibly can, right? So there does seem to be a little bit of evidence that like being warm and positive, it gets to them in the long term. But the analogy that I often use is that like for avoidant people, intimacy is kind of like exercise. Like often in the moment, it doesn't feel good to them, but when you give them some distance to kind of like process what happened to them and give them some space to do that, eventually they're kind of like, oh, actually that was kind of nice. Now I'm going to choose to come back for more, right? So it requires patience, and it also requires recognizing that they may not be as invested in the relationship as you. And that's where I think that you have to make the decision. For some people, they're fine with that, and for some people it's like, no, I need to be more of a priority than this person is willing to give me.
It's funny, isn't it, that now you're saying it, I think the kind of what you really want is the more attachment anxious people who are a bit more needy, who are willing to work and really want this to work out, but they're the ones that aren't so attractive. But the avoidance ones, they're the ones that you get the rush from, but they're actually probably not the good prospects. for
I mean, for sure. I mean, when we're talking about that dynamic of like who's going to run hot and cold, the avoidant people, and again, right? I mean, to the extent that there's, the people in this chat are like interested in dating men, like this is going to be more of an issue with dating men than dating women, as men are going to be higher in avoidance and play that cat and mouse game a little bit more.
yeah.
I mean, having said that, I mean, in that sense, I mean, I think you're right that you can work with anxiously attached people more. But like, the thing is it's a little bit of a like pick your poison, and that like, the avoidant people, their way of expressing their issues is coldness, whereas like with anxious people, their way of expressing their issues is more of like a negative engagement. So you'll get more anger, for example, out of the anxiously attached people. And again, right, like some people can deal with coldness and they're like, sure, fine, and some people can deal with anger and they're like, sure, fine, right? So it's kind of I don't want to say pick your poison, but that's the phrase that comes to mind.
Also, not all men are avoidant, I'm just saying.
Absolutely not. Yeah, no.
But no, they are out there. But I've got a good question from CG here that I wanted to bring up. But so the question is, why would someone constantly enter the store and pick up my product and not purchase it? He's not leaving the store with the purchase, but he's also not leaving the store. How do I know when to take my product from his inventory?
That's hilarious. I'm not a business psychologist, but I'll try to weigh in here. Yeah, I mean, I think that people are often ambivalent about relationships. And even the more avoidant people have a heart, right? Like there's a part of them that there's good reason to think that everybody gets lonely sometimes, right? And so, even people who don't feel super comfortable when they get into a relationship are attracted to the idea of getting in the relationship. And so I think sometimes what you'll get is, dude is lonely swiping on Tinder, this person is cute, they sound interesting. In the abstract, the idea of a relationship sounds like it's fun. And then when they actually get on the date, and that triggers a lot of stuff for people, right? Like with the avoidant people in particular, again, I think this is up for debate in the literature, but one of the ideas about the avoidant people is that at least for some of them, this is going to be true, where like the reason that they're hesitant about intimacy is that they've gotten burned before. They're in a sense acting rationally in order to be cautious. And so the lonely part of them draws them into the situation. And the part of them that's been burned before makes them cautious when they actually get into the situation, right? Like the flame gets hotter the closer you get to it. And so sometimes you'll get this like back and forth behavior.
Okay. Rapid fire question. Like, can you change that person? And also, when do you know, just for CG's final answer, like when do you know, when do you withdraw? Like when do you just go, no, this is draw a line?
Yeah, I mean, as again becomes clear in the book, it's not your job to change that person. It's that person's job to change themselves, And so in that sense, I think that like they won't change unless they are intrinsically motivated to do something about it, right? So yeah, I mean, the research is pretty clear that like long-term change is possible. I mean, mind you, I don't think that there's such a thing as quick fixes. You wouldn't expect to get in the best shape of your life just by working out for one day, right? So it's about putting long-term investments into this kind of stuff. But it's possible all of us can become healthier. But yeah, it's not your job to change the other person. So I guess that for me would be the key is, are they actually doing work because they're personally motivated to change? That's the kind of person that you can work with. But the person who's like, I don't see this as a problem, why are they going to change? They're just not, So that for me would be a sign that it might be time to think about closing the store and opening in a different location.
Yes. Thank you. So as a few just questions I wanted to go through that people have asked. I think I've got most of the questions that I wanted done, but I'm just rapidly going through these so we can wrap up because we are kind of on time. Sam has asked, what are your thoughts on filling out a Tinder online dating profile? I mean, I can mention what I did here. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, Geoff. And Tinder is really hard because you don't get the same kind of like, ability to explain yourself and what you're looking for as you do on eHarmony or on, some of the other platforms. Bumble was not around when I was dating, but I'm sure that I would have used it if it had been. I only had Tinder and eHarmony and Match, but and RSVP in Australia as well. But Tinder was hard because you was really only based on photo and a couple of lines, and often guys didn't write anything. What I learned to do after meeting some completely inappropriate candidates on Tinder was to use my one line to state as much about myself as I could, so that it would kind of weed out underlined candidates. So I just wrote, I think in my 140 characters or whatever you got, I wrote likes, Hillary Clinton, trees, Michael Jackson, stuff like that, and dislikes, pessimists. And so it's kind of if you're an extreme right wing kind of thing, you're probably going to see that and you're not going to go, oh, this chick is not for me. So that would kind of that was my way of filling out those profiles. Do you have any suggestions there, Geoff?
Not really. Again, I have experience with online dating, and those things are so hard to fill out. It's so hard to convey. And you just can't control how people are going to receive anything that you put out there. So you're just going to get a bunch of randos in any event. So yeah, no, I'll cross my fingers for you. It's also, honestly, I find it tricky to give cross location advice, in that I think that these different dating apps take on a particular culture in different cities, right? So in some places I hear people talk about Tinder as the hookup app, right? Whereas for whatever reason here in Toronto it morphed into a legitimate long-term dating app. So I also think there's some very local microculture with this kind of stuff. But yeah, I don't know. My best advice is to, when you feel like you can trust the person, meet them in person. You'll never get a true sense of somebody from a dating profile.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about this a lot in my book. As I started, I applied business strategy thinking to finding a relationship. I obviously did the one date every week for a year, but then I got better at building filters. And I worked out kind of early on that I needed, I built a sales funnel for my business to get the most number of potential customers at the top. And then I built really good filters to get the ones that are most likely to buy our product at the bottom. And so I did the same thing for dating. And I thought, well, first of all, I need lots of candidates at the top, just like we need lots of customers if we're going to be able to filter well. And so I added more and more channels. So lots of more different dating sites, as well as going to classes and asking friends for introductions. So I got lots and lots of candidates. And then I learned quite early on to build in a screening call. So I did quite systematically, did screening calls on Sunday afternoons and dated on Thursday at the same place, same time, meet for a drink when you can go for dinner after. And it really became a kind of regular activity. And then I jotted down notes as I went on everything that I'd learned. So
I think the screening call is a great idea, because one of the best analyses of online dating that I've seen is, and it's from a business perspective, where they talk about the difference between search goods and experience goods. And so a search good would be like a chair, for example, where if you got a verbal description of a chair, you could probably get pretty good information about whether that's the chair for you or not. But back when people used to buy music on a site like iTunes, there was a reason that there was a clip of the music for people to listen to, because if all it said was this song is 138 beats per minute, it's in the jazz genre, you would have no idea if that was for you or not, right? Because music is what they call an experience good. You need to experience to know if it's you or not. And the thing about sites like Tinder is that they operate as if people are these search goods where you can figure out what you want just from verbal descriptions. Whereas it's when you have the phone call and you actually experience the person, that's like getting the clip of the music, and that's when you'll get a lot better sense of whether that person is for you or not.
Yes. Yeah, it's great. You weed out some awkward conversations that you don't need to have in person and use a whole night to you find there are some kind of guys that are a little creepy, and you can weed them out through a screen call. And also, if your conversation doesn't flow at all, big silences, and you can avoid yourself a kind of awkward night as well. So I don't know, I highly encourage screening calls. And then also there's a bunch of questions. I think we have pretty much addressed all the questions. I know there's lots of different versions of similar questions that have come up, but I think we've talked about all of the topics that have come up in the questions. But there's another question about burnout in dating. I really think, you date on and off for 3 or 4 weeks and then need a break. I definitely would have taken a short breaks, but it really depends. It's just like anything, I think, in life. Like, how much do you want it? And how much, effort are you willing to put in? And, I can say that when you find it at the other end, it's like life can change in a moment. It's not actually like building a business where it takes years and you build it step by step by step. It is really like, you put in all the work, you become the right person, and you kind of put in the work to find the right person. But then it's like, boom, it's like the life just changes. Yeah. So hopefully, I'm hoping that this has encouraged you to keep going and given you some insights as well. We are going to wrap up because we are over time. Geoff, thank you so much.
Yep, my pleasure.
That was really insightful and awesome. Thank you for getting up so early in the morning to join us from Toronto.
I'm not going to lie, I'm going back to bed now. I'm totally going back to bed.
Nice one. Thank you to my lovely husband, Rod, who has been doing the tech and has stayed up to do the tech for the webinar. We figured out how to work it together. Thank you. I want to share my book again. I will send everybody who signed up a link to the book so you can check it out. Some great comments from Geoff at the back, as well as the story and advice from a whole lot of others as well. Good luck, everyone. If you're single and at home, have a glass of wine and stay safe out there. Thank you again. Good night.